I'll put a warning out there to anyone who may be thinking about trying to become a stone carver. It's incredibly addictive. And once you get into this thing, there may be no way out. And once you may fall in love with carving stone at a smaller scale, but once you move up to the big one, it's a little bit hard to go back, or at least it has been for me. It was something that I had talked about with Bill last time I was here. I'll introduce you guys to these 4 sculptures that we've brought out so far. This first abstract one with the hole is called Swan Blossom. That bird bath with the small squirrel there is called Grateful Critter. The double figure with the pearl is called the Pearl, but we call them Frankie and Johnny. And this 3 stack over there is called Forever Tears. The squirrel on top of that bird bath is about the scale that I started working in when I was carving stone. It's really, a curious stone carver is always going to start with something they can carry by hand. You're going to be given a chunk of stone, or you're going to find a scrap somewhere and take it home. And just working the material with time, it doesn't require having the ability to render something. You don't need to be able to draw a person or an animal precisely, but if you have the patience and the time to keep working the surface, it will achieve this incredible level of polish that, after playing in punk rock bands and doing kind of avant-garde performance in rooms full of people, to be able to actually end up after all of the work with something that felt solid and like it could stay in the world was really something that got me so excited about stone carving. But when you're working something that is about this big, or the size of your head, spending time with this material, you sort of realize that to make something that's going to be as big as your body doesn't actually take another set of skills. It just means sizing up your tool and lengthening the amount of time. But if you can carve something this big, the material doesn't get harder when it gets bigger, and it doesn't get harder as you get to the center. So if you understand and learn how to move the material, you're going to be able to make it happen all the way through. When I think about describing this to people, I often say, if you imagined we had a table here and there was a cube of butter and a cube of bread in front of you, if you went to the drawer to find the knife, you would know which one to pull out to get to carve the butter the way, or to cut the bread you would use a serrated knife, or to do the butter you use a butter knife, because you understand that that material is the same consistency all the way through itself. Stone is exactly the same. So once you know how to move into the material, you can proceed with confidence as long as you have the patience. But maybe we'll just kind of like walk around a little bit and get closer to the sculptures. I don't know, is it too much? No, we'll just move around.
The sun feels good.
And we'll wait for everyone a little bit, yeah. I actually, when I started my undergraduate at Hunter College, I went in as an anthropology major. So anthropology was really like at the heart of like my interest and my desire, and actually when I found stone carving, it actually reunited all of these various interests that I have had. But if you think about it, Homo sapiens are human beings. We have been shaping and carving stones for 300,000 years, as long as there have been Homo sapiens, but most of those were about this big. Human beings were nomadic until 10,000 years ago, so the first 290,000 years of our stone carving experience, they were all about this big. So even to endeavor to carve a stone at monumental scale or at human scale, if we think 10,000 years ago was a long time ago, we've been doing it for a while. But if you think about the whole scope of human existence, it's actually something new. And you're not going to carve stone at human scale unless you feel confident that it's going to be safe there. So it wasn't until we had settled societies we started putting all of our effort and energy into doing something like this. And in my opinion, to put that sort of effort into something is almost an optimistic belief that there's going to be enough peace and stability surrounding that object that it's going to be safe to be there in general, is something I'm always thinking when I'm carving at this scale. We're here on the east coast of the United States. This has been a coastline 4 times since the Earth formed. We keep kissing into West Africa and Scotland if we look about it in a really long time scale. Sedimentary, all the stones that you're going to find in the world, 2 main types: sedimentary stone and igneous stone. Sedimentary stone is biological material that piles up on the bottom of the sea and then gets crushed and pushed together. Igneous stone is lava, is liquid stone that then hardens. So marble and limestone and alabaster, these are relatively soft. That's going to be this stone. This stone here on the bottom is granite. But because this is this ancient coastline, the meat of marble, and this is from your countertop to like the front of skyscrapers in Manhattan, the actual white stuff, the body of marble, is the skeletal remains of the earliest life here on Earth and on this coast. And the black, the veining that you see in marble would be trees and brush that blew in and then sunk down into the stone. Just before I started carving stone, I had never thought about what this thing is, but since I'm spending months with my head in these things, I'm just like, I'm eating the stone, and I've just become like very interested and sensitized to like what the material itself is. Direct carving, when I say that, we're kind of thinking about 2 main approaches that you could have if you were going to make a big stone sculpture. You could make a small model and then try and transfer that directly into the stone. So most of the maybe figurative sculptures that you see at government buildings or in public parks, the way those had been created was a model had been made and then that was scaled up into the stone, and that method is thinking about the stone almost as a raw material that the form gets pressed into. Like 100 years ago, when if we think about the beginning of abstract painting or just abstraction in general as an international art making mode, when artists were trying to figure out what is going to be the place of stone carving in a world where abstract art is being made, the practice of direct carving was sort of born. It's the idea that we're not making a model and pushing it into the stone. We just start carving directly into the stone, and you let the grain and the internal crystalline structure of the stone, the natural fissures that were formed when the stone was being pulled out of the earth, to determine what the final form of the sculpture is going to be. If you see even the figurative sculptures, you almost lose the whole in that because you just think about it as being these 2 separate sculptures. But after spending so much time with the sculptures, I see the whole as a way for the viewer both to have this sort of experience where as you're walking around the piece, you sort of locate yourself when you see through it. And it's also a way of sort of framing the piece by locking it to the landscape behind it as you sort of like, your vision sort of passes through. Does anyone have any questions at this moment? Should I just keep going?
Can I ask a real quick question?
Sure.
So you're working, you're looking at the piece.
Yeah.
You have your tools, and you start approaching the piece, and then you develop what it's going to be. You don't, like you work in an immediate way?
That's correct. Yeah. So really direct carving, as opposed to working from a model,
Yes.
we're just
Or
a drawing. Correct.
no drawing.
No drawing. If you go to museums or galleries now and you're seeing stone sculpture, like 98% of the sculpture is being carved by a robotic arm. Almost all of it.
Oh, no.
People are scanning objects and then printing them into stone and having an army of people sort of carve at them. I'm not sure what everyone's previous knowledge is about the history of stone carving. However, Rodin, for example, we know Rodin, and you could go to the Louvre and see a marble thinker. Rodin did not carve that sculpture. Rodin made a small clay model, sent it to a stone carver's shop, and the stone carver scaled his model up into the stone. In that way, that was how most of the neoclassical and or figurative sculptures that you see all over the world were sculpted in that way. But coming out of Rodin's studio, literally Brancusi, Jose de Kreeft, later Noguchi, these stone carvers saw that practice happening, but were attempting to, well, like all modern movements, they were trying to figure out what is sculpture going to be in this new modern world of technology and trains and planes, and their whole movement was known as the direct carving movement. Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, when you see their sculptures, they weren't making models and having stone carvers carve them up. Their whole idea was that the art happens in the moment that the artist is engaging with the stone.
So do you feel close to the early 3,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago people that carved?
Yes, and I would say, you know, and we could even, why don't we stroll along? Oh my God, you can touch them too. Since the artist is here, feel free to put your hands on the sculptures. When I'm not here, I don't know about it, but you know, just back to this question of whether or not I'm feeling sort of like an affinity for sculptors for thousands of years ago. A lot of the sculptures that were coming out of the direct carving movement, a lot of people talk about sort of like the reference that they have to sort of ancient sculpture. I think a lot of that is just coming out of the practice of direct carving lends to specific types of forms. So if you think about a stone actually wants to be round. So if you have a stone rolling down a river, over time with action, the high points on a stone want to get knocked off as there's action on it, and the stone wants to become round. In that same way, if you have a block of stone and you just start going at it with a chisel, the stone naturally wants to curve. And so you actually end up, instead of just viewing it as something where you're trying to push a form into it, the practice actually ends up of just going and just putting energy and knocking the tool at the sculpture, and then you're just actually finding the point where these curves sort of meet and find each other. All of the marble here that you're seeing was quarried up in Vermont. We actually have this one of the most robust marble Thank you. But what did I want to say? I didn't even want to say like industry. Like there's a word that's just not coming to me now. But for a while between like 1900 before the Depression, there was more marble coming out of Vermont than there was coming out of Italy. It's incredible. you know, there is a vein of marble that runs from Vermont down to North Carolina. It cuts through New York up in Inwood. Actually, if you ever go walking around up there, you can see some of these veins cutting through there. Actually, the Hudson River and the East River, those channels actually used to be packed full of marble. And then when the last glaciers melted, they melted all the marble back out and shot the calcium out into the Atlantic Ocean, and it turned into all the clam shells that we ate, and you will find it in the oyster shells that you eat even now today. In this way, if you really, well, when you spend so much time with the stone, because it takes a long time to carve it, you start thinking like, what is this stuff? And you know, in that same way that calcium was in the earth and went out, the bones in your arms actually and your teeth, it's that same calcium. So we have this direct connection to the stone. People always say that your body is mostly water, but I think the truth is that your body is mostly water and stone. But a stone carver would say that to you. And I just started carving the material and like digging into the history of stone carving. I was working on these bird baths, like you see Grateful Critter over here. I had started, my impulse was to make figurative sculpture. I had gotten really inspired by this sculptor, William Edmondson. He is like the first African American to have a solo show at MoMA. He makes these incredible, he didn't start carving stone until he was 60. And then he made just like hundreds of these incredible sculptures, but he was untrained. And what I loved about his work was there was no he found a block of stone and like a railroad tie and just like a normal hammer from the store, and he just started carving right into the stone. You could tell by the forms of the sculpture that there was no barrier for him. He wasn't like, am I allowed to do this? He just felt like he had complete permission to just start going right into it with no training or no permission. And since I had no training and no one was giving me permission, this idea of just like getting the tools and just starting to carve right in and see what happens was the approach that I went with. He was doing all these animal forms. I started making them, and I was like, I'll just do this. I'll be the guy that makes these bird baths forever, and I'll be the happiest guy in the world, because I was feeling satisfied by the process. But as I was carving these sculptures, I was listening to this book called The Agony and the Ecstasy. Are we familiar? It's like a pulpy biography of Michelangelo, who made some of the most incredible stone sculptures in the history of the world, as well as wrote a lot of poetry and wrote a lot about the act of stone carving in such a beautiful way, just about the spiritual engagement that like a person has by confronting a block of stone and moving at it with energy and intention. And I'm like carving this little like squirrel sculpture, and like Michelangelo through time, through this auto book, says to me, the ultimate subject matter for sculpture is the human form, because you can represent the full spectrum of emotions from agony to ecstasy. And I was like, oh, dang. If really the thing to do is to carve a human figure in stone, then I have to at least try now. And that's how you end up with a 9,000 pound, that's how you end up with a 9,000 pound block of stone, because I just couldn't imagine being so in love with stone carving and having one of the masters say the thing that you have to do is try and carve a human figure in stone and not at least endeavor to do it. This is my second figurative sculpture, but you know, it's called the Pearl. but we call them Frankie and Johnny. It's an allegory about the paradoxical relationship between freedom and justice. This is why we make art, though, because no one wants to necessarily listen to me talk for a half an hour about that paradoxical relationship, but I hope that in some way it's carried in the form of this sculpture. Yeah.
Spoon and a book? What are they?
It's a knife and a book.
A knife?
It's a knife and a book. Yeah, it's a knife and a book. Yeah. You know, I'll say one. We'll give the brief version. The idea would be that possibly freedom and justice, I would say, are human needs, like hunger, like air. We need these things. For example, if you put a human in a cage, they will lose their mind perhaps to the point of death. If you have two small children and you give one cookie and you give the other 2 cookies, violence will erupt immediately. And this is a universal, and it is because we have a need both for freedom and for justice. However, we can go out on the streets. I was into radical politics when I was younger, so from experience, you can be out on the streets shouting for freedom and for justice. However, as freedom gets maximized, the possibility for justice goes down. As our ability to ensure that justice is being enacted, freedom goes down. So they can't actually be maximized at the same time, but we need them both. So it's actually, we're in a paradoxical relationship with these 2 needs. This is what my sculpture is about. Yeah. Yeah.
And the pearl?
And the pearl, yeah. So I have my friend, I also write. I'm on this long walk with my philosopher friend, and we're like, if freedom and justice are in this paradoxical relationship, if they were personified as figures and they're holding something, I was like, Tom, what are they holding? And he's like, the pearl. I was like, okay, it's the pearl. It's hard. It's the pearl because it's a little bit ineffable. It's difficult to exactly name what that thing is, but we know when we have it, and I hope none of us ever feel what it is not to have that balance. This sculpture is called Forever Tears. Forever Tears. It's all 3 of these stones come from Vermont. It's this bottom gray stone is West Rutland gray. That center stone is Champlain black, which is this beautiful stone that they stopped quarrying in the 70s. But if you get into stone carving, you then are on the constant and forever hunt for stone, and you'll meet a bunch of wild guys in Vermont that have these little hidden fields of stone. And I go up there now, and whenever I find the Champlain black, we could come over and get even closer if you want. I love this stone because you can, it really preserves, you can see the seashells in there. It's being this sort of frozen moment in geological time and space. This Champlain black just holds that for me in this way. And then this is Vermont Danby. If you were ever looking for stone for your house on the East Coast, they would have put some Vermont Danby in front of your face. It's the largest functioning underground quarry in the world actually right now, and they're still pulling some beautiful stone out of it. Its internal crystalline structure is some of the closest stone that you can find to Carrara in the world, and it just so happens to be up the road in Vermont, which is lucky for me.
What is the little hole in the top symbolize?
So Homo sapiens we've been around for like 300,000 years, but even our ancestors much further going back, like 2 million years ago, there were large primates that were shaping stones. Even our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, made stone tools. They did not make holes. They didn't drill holes in things. It's actually, if you are walking through a history museum and you see an object that has a hole drilled through it, you know it was created by a Homo sapien. It's just like this mark of the human being. Also, it's most of these sculptures that I was talking about that are being carved by that robotic arm, the way that those sculptures are entered into the program that carves them, you have to enter a skin into it, which is just the outside. That tool runs around shaping the stone, but it can't go right through. So in that way, this is like both even if I wasn't here, 10,000 years from now, someone will look at this and they'll see the hole and know it was human done. And anyone that carves stone or anyone that's involved in the process of stone sculptures being made are going to look at that and see it as the mark of the hand, of the artist actually engaging with the material. And as that goes, as most of the sculptures, those sculptures that we're seeing are essentially being printed, I think that there's actually so much to be gained actually through the engaging with the material itself. I want to advocate for that in stone carving, as well as I want to more broadly advocate for that in life, for people to actually just go out and be in the world, engage with something that is absolutely not predictable. As a stone carver, I will tell you, you will have an idea of what you're looking for. You're then going to run into the block of stone, you're going to push into it, and you're going to find that it has a life of its own. And the daily practice of negotiating between your intentions and your hopes for the work, and then what is even available to you based on the stone for things that happened 1,000,000 years ago. There was something happened on the earth, and you're going to run into it in the middle of your stone block. And the negotiation required to make work in this way, I'm hoping is sort of like present to anyone, even without having to listen to me stand here and describe this whole process to you, that the form of the sculpture itself sort of carries that concept with you. Yeah? Yeah? Anyone have any questions?
Where does the name come from?
Forever Tears? Well, you know, it was, I'm trying not to be too leading with the sculpture, you know. Some desperation at what was like happening in the world.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, the reason why I love stone carving, actually, I had said that I had really like used, I had tried almost every creative field, from painting to music to writing, and it wasn't until I found stone that I felt like I had found sort of like a language where I was sort of like able to express myself in. And while I was making this piece, I was like, I was feeling more unsettled with the future than I am at this exact moment. But that.
So, historically for your work, the first one is the bird bath? And then
Yes, the first one was the bird bath. As this goes, the first one was the bird bath. And then he's not here. The sculpture's called The Return. His name is Connie, but he sold at the last show, so he's going out to California. But then I carved a figure. Mm-hmm. And then, I've been then researching the whole history of stone carving, and I landed on direct carving, and then real Barbara Hepworth, we know, you know, I got hip to her work. She wrote also so beautifully about the act of stone carving. And if you've ever seen a Barbara Hepworth, every single one of them has a hole punched through it. She started by making figurative sculptures about the size of that squirrel. And then she encountered the stone carvings of Jean Arp, who we know mostly kind of as a Dada artist. He spent the last 40 years of his life direct carving stone. She went to an ARP show and it blew her mind, and she went back to her studio and made this small sculpture that's called pierced form. And then the next 50 years of her life, every single one of her sculptures was this pierced form. And she speaks so beautifully about what that is to spend the time to like actually penetrate this unpenetrable thing as an artist. And I, as maybe you've sort of got this sense that when I get excited about something, i.e. like Michelangelo says you have to carve a human figure at scale, I like to know for myself in this sort of like classic way of like only really knowing something by doing it yourself. You can read about what it's like, but to actually spend the time with it and do it, there's like more to be learned. And so then I kind of started exploring the abstract sculptures. So people have been asking me if I am leaning towards one or the other, more figurative or more abstract, but I plan on doing both. And I think that there's a lot to be found in both approaches.
Thank you.
How do you move these?
Oh yeah. So I was saying, you know, the yeah, exactly. That was our big crane. I love. I used to play in bands and sort of like book these like tours across the country that would only be like half booked, but you would just sort of like get everyone together, get all the equipment, and just sort of head out there. That part, the performance of wrangling all the required people and tools. Most of the stone that's quarried in this world is not heading for the art world. So all the people who are involved in extracting it from the earth and like sending them out there, I love meeting all these people, making a friend. My studio is in East New York, in Brooklyn, in an area where they're polishing like all the marble countertops for like New York City. And I rent a little corner of a yard that's full of countertops and the back of a warehouse that's full of sinks. But all the I've just just by meeting people, favors and a crane. Yeah, cranes and flatbeds. Yeah, cranes and flatbeds. Is everyone all right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Should we go in and have cider? And if anyone else has any other questions, we keep doing that.
I also, yeah,